Hey everyone, this is part of my conversation with Tucker Carlson. Do me a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel right now. Hit the subscribe button and listen to this entire conversation at members.charliekirk.com. You also get a special hat when you become a member. So get your special hat. Listen to this entire conversation, members.charliekirk.com, and hit that subscribe button. Enjoy. Tucker Carlson, welcome back.
Oh, Charlie, I never roll through this town without seeing you. Well, it's always the highlight.
It's that's the advantage of being in Phoenix, is that you're like one of the only shows in town, so everyone kind of just comes on by.
Yeah, and it's like Phoenix. Definitely, I've been coming to Phoenix my whole life as a native Californian, and your studio increasingly seems like an oasis in Phoenix.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's better architecture than most of the buildings in Phoenix.
That is true. This whole
Higher
town,
ceilings, a little bit.
Well, I would say almost every city in the West is an offense, except San Francisco is really kind of an offense against architecture.
But so what's your take on Frank Lloyd Wright?
You know, certainly.
I ask because he has a whole outpost here.
Yes, I'm aware. I mean, I'm not impressed by Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm not. I mean, don't even get me going on the subject of design. I become unbearable.
Yes.
But no, I mean, I think a building of any kind should serve the physical needs of the people inside of it. And one thing that I've always been unimpressed by in Frank Lloyd Wright's designs is they don't work very well.
Yes, no, they're not functional.
They leak.
And if I'm not mistaken, but like some of the homes in the portion of Florida that I know that you're in actually are Frank Lloyd Wright inspired or look like Frank Lloyd, correct?
Right. I mean, there's a school of architectural design out of Sarasota, Florida in the 60s, which is very much related to what was going on in LA at the time and earlier in the 50s, which is modernist in a sense, but is also kind of rooted in the landscape, makes use of the natural environment around the building, which is the key, I think. But just one thing about Frank Lloyd Wright, I really like Spanish colonial, and one of the things I like about it is that it sort of suits the environment in which it was built. So like an Adobe home.
It configures to the
100%. It responds to the landscape. So if you're building in 19th century Maine, you're building out of wood, of course. You're building out of pine because that's the main source of wood there, and you're doing it in a way that works. They can handle the massive snow load of the winter. They can handle the rain and the cold, et cetera, et cetera. It's like it actually serves the people who live in the building, and you see that like in New Mexico, parts of Arizona,
Santa Fe,
the old architecture works. And Frank Lloyd Wright is, I guess what I'm saying is a little bit too theoretical for me.
Yes.
Sort of in love with his own theories over and against like the practical, and I feel like building materials and styles should be very practical.
But it's not insignificant because Frank Lloyd Wright was during that time of the kind of proliferation of modern architecture.
Totally.
And
it was theory-based.
You said something interesting, but it's not self-evident to most people. The building should serve the people that will live there.
Well, of course.
Why and how did that change? When all of a sudden philosophical abstraction started to infiltrate our architecture?
I think a lot of the people who sort of took control of the design business, but also the movement, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, I mean, they hated people, and they saw people as widgets to be assembled. It was this weird sort of mixture of the assembly line mentality of the industrial age with Marxism, both of which see people as kind of expendable.
Yes.
And so the whole idea of like worker housing, that they were all in like it's a hive.
Yes.
And we're all in identical little cubes because we're serving the greater good, we're serving the organization. I just reject that.
Yes.
I believe in the individual because God created the individual. Each person has a name and a soul, and every hair on his head is known by God. So if you come at design with that belief, then you're going to make things that are elevating to the human spirit, that are pleasing to the eye, that are keep the occupants warm in the winter and cool in the summer, that won't leak, because you care about the people who are living inside the building. And I think there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that the people who changed West design in the West, beginning in the 30s, but were just accelerated and became the consensus after the war. Those people like just had no interest in the individual at all. They believed in the collective, and it really shows. And it's So I've just, in my own tiny little personal life, we just reject that completely.
Yes.
And don't have any contact with that at all. I mean, I don't like modern, I mean, I have a lot of eccentric views too that are probably not supportable, but just are more reactions and instincts that are probably pretty eccentric. But yeah, and we rely too much on the mechanical and the electric and modern building materials, or leaving aside their effect on physical health, which is probably really bad. Like, you shouldn't be living in a room full of plastics and drywall, like, obviously.
Or super low ceiling with fluorescent light.
100%. And everything is...
we live in Phoenix and we have like no natural light in our buildings.
I woke up this morning, so we don't use air conditioning at all, ever. We don't have air conditioning, period. We don't use air conditioning, don't like it.
That wouldn't work here.
No, it wouldn't work here. That's exactly right. So I woke up in a hotel room this morning in Phoenix. I was like, I can't breathe. Probably because I've been on the Western Maine diet of like gas station food for the last 3 months. So, the fatter you get, the more you snore. But it's more than that. It's the bad air.
Of course.
It's really noticeable.
Yes.
Like, we haven't slept with a closed door in, many years. Ever.
In both Florida and Maine?
Oh, yeah. We leave Florida before it becomes too hot, and
that's amazing.
we leave Maine when it's pretty darn cold. But we have a lot of dogs, and, they're happy to sleep under the covers, so it works.
So the ugly seems to triumph over the beautiful.
Well, the ugly is intentional. I mean, the elevation of the disease, the deranged, the deformed, it's not an accident at all. The ugliest things, the ugliest people, the ugliest attitudes in our society are venerated.
But what is that?
It's an attack on God, of course. Beauty comes from God, right? The design of nature is God's design, so it's the prettiest thing. So all art that's worth anything mimics the natural design. Like, there's never been a painting prettier than like what you can see at dawn where you live, if you can see outside, of course. And so if you have a movement or then a culture that intentionally elevates the ugliest things, then that you have, it's just an attack on God, obviously. And I could go on and on the subject, but
doing it.
No, of course.
It's not talked about enough because it actually intersects with our politics and our lives.
Well, completely. So if something is, and this is not the only society to reach this point, there have been quite a few in the last 100 years. I don't think you're allowed to mention them anymore, but anyway, that intentionally elevate the disgusting and the diseased and the immoral, the amoral or immoral, purposefully immoral, over the self-evidently, beautiful, which is to say clean, orderly, symmetrical.
Yes. Uplifting.
Of course. These are not complicated concepts. You know them instantly when you see them.
They're
Does
built
it
into
please
our
you?
soul,
So,
of
right.
course, yeah.
Symmetry is part of nature. It's immediately, the arch.
Yes.
Rather
the circle
than
is the perfect shape.
Of course.
Buildings point up to
course.
God. I mean, this is not
Of
difficult,
course,
right?
it's not difficult. It doesn't need to be
Once it's explained, you're like, oh, well, yeah, of course.
a medieval cathedral to be
Of course.
beautiful.
No, that's right.
A clapboard house in a pine forest can be every bit, in my opinion, can be every bit as pretty as Notre Dame, or maybe even prettier, actually, because it doesn't have the French tendency to overbuild and make everything, rococo and crazy complicated.
Opulence, right?
Yeah, totally, to mimic the French brain, which is like
a little bit
too complicated for its own good. But as a Protestant, I just sort of, I like the clean lines, but that's just a preference. Both of them are seeking the same thing, which is beauty. And so it's almost like parenting. If you start out sort of trying to do your best, you'll get close enough. I'm sure there are a lot of good parenting books. I've never read one, but the whole point of parenting is if you really love your children and seek the best from them, you'll make tons of mistakes. But you're not going to get too far off course, probably. But if you seek to hurt your kids, it's really easy to do that. And a lot of people do for a bunch of different reasons. But design is exactly the same. If you seek beauty, you may wind up at a different variety than I prefer, but you're not going to be too far off. You're not going to build a glass box.
For people that aren't quite there yet in the audience, the design and the architecture reflects the morality of the moment, or the lack thereof, or the cultural landscape. And you have a theory that art, literature, architecture went south to the disgusting and ugly after we decided to use the bomb.
I think so. I mean, there were certainly strains. I mean, there have always been strains.
Explain why you think that.
And it's just a theory. I mean, I don't have any evidence. I don't think it's on Wikipedia, therefore it's not true.
No, I think it's incredibly compelling, though, is that we use the ultimate force of the eradication of life, and all of a sudden we tend to become an uglier society.
Yeah, and I don't in any way mean to criticize the indiscriminate murder of civilians at all, because I know that that's not allowed.
Well,
I don't want to piss off Jonah Goldberg, okay, by
okay.
questioning the decision
really
to drop
hates me,
a
by the
bomb
way.
on Nagasaki on a Catholic church, on Japan's Christian population. But and again, I don't have, hard evidence of this, but I've just noticed, really in design, in architectural design, that there's a line, pretty bright line, between pre and post-war design. In New York City, you're going to pay a lot more for a pre-war apartment than a post-war apartment.
Absolutely.
Why is that? Well, because it's prettier. And by prettier, I mean it's serving the needs of the people who live there. Like, normal people like to have a fireplace. There's something wonderful and sort of atavistic, not sort of atavistic, literally atavistic. It appeals to something ancient within you, sitting in front of an open fire. And so, if you were designing a living place for people, you would go out of your way to have a wood stove or a hearth, because that's appealing to the deepest desires of the occupants. And if you intentionally eliminate that, and I'm not against central heating, I have it. We don't use it, but I have it. It's more efficient, but is it more pleasing? No, of course it's not. Is forced air a more pleasant experience?
It drives me crazy.
Than radiant
living
heat?
with it all the time. I mean, it's just you get used to it, and then you go to a place without it. You're like, oh wow, this is a better way to live.
Yeah, I would never have that. I mean, I don't have to, because
Right. If you lived here, it'd be tough not to. I mean,
of course it would be. And I don't mean to judge. And
No, you could totally judge. It's fine.
I'm also 55 and can kind of live wherever I want.
Sure.
And so you've got massive advantages in middle age if you are not deeply in debt. I actually would argue it's not that expensive to live a little better than most people live, but it's a trade-off for sure. And I have more options than most people, so I don't in any way mean to be sitting in judgment of 24-year-olds who live in shared apartments in Midtown or whatever. They're doing the best they can. I get it, and I think the system is arrayed against them. However, if you cared about the people who lived in a building, you would design the building for their pleasure. Excuse me. And what you saw post-war is just the opposite. People herded into spaces like cattle. Actually, I think most cattle live better, at least where I live, than they do in our big cities. And that change really took place at exactly 1945 or thereabouts. So I just noticed that as a former resident of an American city, a couple American cities, and as a frequent traveler around the United States, where I was born and love and know the country pretty well. And it's like, what is this? Why World War II? And what seemed evident to me is that, the most basic sin that people commit is imagining they're God. And of course, I'm God. I don't, I'm totally independent. I can make my own decisions about life or death. And, I'm in charge of the universe. That's the fundamental conceit that people have through all periods of history, and especially now. And there is something about atomic power, the power of atomic weapons, that would naturally,
almost.
well, it may in fact be metaphysical.
No, that's what I'm saying. It flirts on that line.